He was the last member of Nolan Wells's inner circle to speak on camera. He was on the boat that day, and after weeks of silence, following reports that his own family had received threats over their connection to this case, he finally agreed to answer questions. What was Nolan actually like in his final hours? Why did the group leave the island early? And why, according to the family's own attorney, do the accounts from that day still not line up? This case remains active. No official cause of death has been confirmed. Everything here comes from on-record statements, official documentation, and interviews already made public. Where accounts conflict, we'll tell you plainly that they conflict, rather than choosing one for you. There's a reason a case like this doesn't fade once the headlines move on. It isn't only the mystery, it's the family living inside it. A mother still standing in the exact moment she said goodbye to her son. A father trying to reconcile the boy he raised with a story that doesn't sound like him. Siblings walking past a bedroom that hasn't changed since the beginning of July. Every new detail that surfaces in this case isn't just information. It's another weight handed to a family who has to carry it, whether or not it brings them any closer to an answer. The interview at the center of this update was conducted after 2 full days spent with the young man identified as Warren, giving him time to open up before any cameras rolled. What followed was the most detailed personal account yet of the hours leading up to Nolan's disappearance. But it landed inside a case that already had a serious problem. Too many separate stories, not enough of them actually matching. For a family desperate for clarity, every new voice added to this story has, so far, only added one more thread they have to untangle. It's worth naming plainly what a case like this actually asks of the people covering it and the people watching it. Every new interview, every new document, every new timestamp arrives carrying the promise of clarity and, more often than not, delivers instead another layer of complexity the family has to sort through publicly, in real time, with an audience watching every step. That's an unusual kind of pressure to place on grief, and it's worth remembering as we go through what Warren actually said. Warren didn't hesitate when asked about his bond with Nolan. He described him as more than a friend, someone he considered family, a connection stretching back to elementary school, through middle school, high school, and their first year of college. He said the two stayed close the entire time, talking constantly, and that in all those years, they never once had a real falling out. He pushed back firmly against any suggestion that Nolan was difficult to be around, describing him instead as someone who never had an unkind word for anyone. That description matters beyond simple character reference, because it isn't standing alone. Nolan's own parents have described their son the same way, someone with a big heart, the kind of young man who made people feel seen. His football coach used almost identical language, calling him humble and universally respected. 3 separate people describing the same young man in nearly the same words, without ever coordinating with one another. That kind of consistency is worth noting specifically because so little else in this case has held together the same way. Warren also addressed something that had drawn criticism online, comments attributed to Nolan's mother suggesting she didn't know her son's friend group well. He explained that while the group spent enormous amounts of time together, they typically gathered at his house or another friend's house rather than at Nolan's, and that he had crossed paths with Nolan's father over the years, even without being around Nolan's parents often. In his account, that physical distance had nothing to do with how close the friendship actually was. There's something quietly painful sitting inside that clarification. A grieving mother being publicly second-guessed about whether she even knew her own son's friends, while simultaneously trying to hold a family together in real time. It's a small detail in a much larger story, but it's a reminder of just how much scrutiny this family has endured, down to the most ordinary, personal corners of their son's life. Then came the details of July 4th itself, and Warren's account offered the clearest picture yet of just how large that day really was. According to him, this wasn't a small private outing. The trip to Horn Island was something this entire friend group did every year, a Gulf Coast tradition as routine as the holiday itself. On this particular trip, he estimated somewhere between 20 and 30 people traveled together across 3 separate boats, directly contradicting earlier online claims that it had only been Nolan and a small handful of others. He described arriving at the island by mid-morning to a scene he struggled to fully put into words. Boats lined up for what looked like miles in either direction, thousands of people spread across the shoreline, in places 3 rows deep. By his account, the group wasn't isolated on some quiet stretch of sand. They were in the middle of one of the most crowded gatherings the island sees all year. Think about what that actually means for the investigation. Thousands of potential witnesses. Thousands of phones capable of capturing a photo or a video. And yet, weeks later, the clearest account of Nolan's final hours still comes down to a small handful of friends, each describing the same afternoon slightly differently. In a crowd that size, somebody saw something. The real challenge investigators face isn't a shortage of witnesses. It's finding the right ones and getting them to actually come forward. Once ashore, Warren said the day unfolded the way it always does. Music, food, friends catching up with people they hadn't seen since high school. He said he spoke with Nolan more than once that day, describing him as relaxed and in good spirits every time their paths crossed. Nothing in his account suggested anything unusual. Hold on to that detail, because it's the last point in this story where everyone still seems to agree. Nolan was fine. Nolan was happy. Nolan was, by every account so far, exactly the person his family and friends have always described. Whatever happened to him did not happen because something was visibly wrong that day. It happened somewhere in the space between an ordinary afternoon and a phone call 2 days later that changed everything for his family. At some point that afternoon, Warren says the group's boat developed a mechanical problem, forcing them to head back earlier than planned. According to his account, Nolan chose to stay behind, intending to return later with a different group of friends. This is where Warren's personal account meets something far more concrete. Newly surfaced emergency audio, obtained by a national outlet, appears to confirm part of this timeline in a way few details in this case have been independently verified so far. The recording captures a distress call placed by the operator of the boat carrying Warren and the rest of that group, reporting mechanical failure as they attempted to leave the island. That call was placed at approximately 4 p.m., roughly an hour after Nolan was reportedly last seen. Separately, GPS records obtained from state marine authorities show the boat actually departed Horn Island at 4:31 that same afternoon, a timestamp precise almost to the minute. For the first time, this isn't just one friend's memory of how the day unfolded. It's documentation, a recorded call, a tracked departure time, 2 independent pieces of hard evidence that, so far, line up with what Warren and the other friend on that boat have said publicly. There's a strange kind of relief in a detail like that, and a strange kind of heartbreak alongside it. Relief, because for once, something in this timeline can be verified independent of anyone's memory or motive. Heartbreak, because even with a timestamp this precise, it tells us nothing about what happened to Nolan in the hours after that boat pulled away. The evidence can confirm exactly when his friends left. It cannot tell us what happened to the friend they left behind. What comes next is the part investigators still haven't been able to reconcile, where the accounts genuinely stop matching each other. Subscribe now, because when this contradiction finally gets resolved, you'll want to have followed exactly how we got there. Warren's account is not the only one that exists, and the others do not all agree with each other, or with him. One detail involves a young woman Nolan reportedly met on the island that day, someone several accounts suggest he spent time with in his final hours before the group departed. According to Nolan's mother, that young woman reached out to her directly early on, to describe what had happened between her and Nolan. Her description, as the mother has since related it, was brief, a passing hello, then goodbye, nothing more. But that isn't the impression Nolan's mother has been left with from everyone else she's spoken to. In her own words, what she heard from that young woman didn't match what she was hearing from other people who were there that day. She's called it plainly one more example of the inconsistencies surrounding her son's death. Inconsistencies that, weeks later, she still can't fully explain and still can't let go of. Try to imagine sitting with that as a parent, being handed one version of your child's final hours by someone who may have spent real time with him that afternoon, only to have that account quietly contradicted by nearly everyone else you talk to. Not enough to prove anything, not enough to disprove anything either, just enough to make you question every account you're given afterward, including the ones that sound the most reassuring. That's a particular kind of exhaustion most people never have to experience. Every phone call becomes a test. Every kind word from a stranger offering condolences arrives wrapped in a quiet, unavoidable question. Do they know something they haven't told me? A mother shouldn't have to function as her own investigator while also trying to grieve. And yet that's exactly the position Nolan's mother has occupied for weeks now, carrying both jobs at once, because no one else can carry either one for her. That contradiction hasn't gone unnoticed by the family's attorney. Ben Crump, who has led an independent investigation running parallel to the official one, has said directly that the accounts from that day simply don't match. Someone, in his words, is telling the truth. Someone is not. And until investigators determine which is which, he said the case can't move forward with real confidence. That's not a small statement. It's an attorney representing a grieving family, standing in front of cameras, telling the public that somewhere among the friends who were on that island, there's an account that doesn't hold up, and that identifying whose account that is has become central to the entire investigation. Consider what it means for an attorney to say that publicly about a group of young people who were, by nearly every account, Nolan's closest friends. It means this family has reached a point where trust alone isn't enough anymore. It means love for their son now has to coexist with suspicion toward people they may have known for years. People who sat at their dinner table, people who called their son a brother. That's one of the harder truths sitting underneath this entire case. Grief doesn't get to stay simple here. It gets tangled up with doubt, and there's no way to separate the two until the facts finally catch up. There's an explanation that's circulated as the leading theory almost since the beginning, that Nolan simply wandered off from the group at some point, and that whatever happened afterward, including his phone being left behind, was a tragic accident. A drowning, nothing more. Nolan's parents have rejected that explanation sharply, and repeatedly. In their view, a simple accidental drowning doesn't account for everything they've been told, everything that doesn't add up, and everything that's shifted the longer this investigation has gone on. They've said, in no uncertain terms, that they believe something more troubling may have happened to their son, and that it's possible whoever is responsible has tried to keep the truth from surfacing. That's an extraordinarily difficult thing for any parent to say publicly about their child's death. It means living every day with the possibility that someone who was there, someone who may have even offered them condolences, knows more than they've said. It means grieving a son while simultaneously distrusting the explanations being offered by people they once trusted completely. Most grieving parents, however devastating their circumstances, are at least able to trust the account they're given. Nolan's parents don't have that. They're grieving and investigating at the same time, because no one has yet handed them a version of events they can fully believe. Law enforcement, for its part, has continued to ask for patience, saying investigators need time to be thorough before reaching any conclusion, and maintaining that no clear signs of foul play have been found so far. But so far is doing real work in that sentence, and the family has made clear they don't consider it sufficient. There's a real human cost to a phrase like that. For investigators, so far is a careful, standard qualifier, meant to avoid overstating what's actually known before all the evidence is in. For a family hearing that same phrase repeated week after week, it starts to feel like something else entirely, like being told gently to keep waiting, without ever being told how long or what exactly they're waiting for. Warren's own family has its own complicated place in this story, including threats that followed them simply for being connected to it. Subscribe now, because understanding what both families are actually living through matters for how this entire case should be read. Warren has his own complicated place in this story. He's the son of a local judge, a detail that became public early on and added another layer of scrutiny to an already intense public conversation. It was Warren who called Nolan's mother on the night of July 4th, alerting her that her son hadn't come home, a call that set the entire search into motion. His mother has said publicly that Warren has fully cooperated with investigators and that her own family has received threats since this case gained national attention. Threats serious enough that she said she feared for her own children's safety. Sit with that for a moment. A second family, watching their own children become targets of anger and suspicion online simply for having been present on a crowded island on a national holiday. Whatever the truth of what happened to Nolan turns out to be, that reality, teenagers connected to both sides of this story, now living in fear for their own safety, is one of the clearest signs of how far this case has traveled beyond anyone's control. Both families are, in their own ways, living through a version of the same fear. One is afraid because their son is gone and they don't know why. The other is afraid because their son was there, and the public has decided that alone makes him a suspect. Neither fear cancels out the other. Both are the direct result of a single afternoon on an island that no one involved could have known would change their lives permanently. A public panel has already weighed in on the timing of Warren's decision to finally speak, suggesting that both the delay and the content of his account only deepen the questions around Nolan's death, rather than resolve them. Whether or not that judgment is entirely fair, it reflects where public sentiment currently sits. An account delivered weeks after the fact, however detailed, arrives into a conversation already shaped by suspicion, and has to work harder to be believed because of it. That's one of the quieter tragedies running underneath this case. Even if every word Warren has said turns out to be true, he now has to speak into a public conversation that has largely already made up its mind to doubt him. His grief doesn't get to exist in a simple space either. He lost someone he calls a brother, and now has to defend his own account of that loss in front of an audience that may never fully believe him, regardless of what the evidence eventually shows. If any part of this update told you something you hadn't heard before, that alone says something about how much of this story is still surfacing in pieces. Subscribe now, because more documentation and more testimony are emerging by the week, and we'll bring you each piece the moment it's confirmed. So where does that leave the actual, confirmable facts of this case right now? Here is only what can be said with real confidence. Documented evidence, a distress call, GPS tracking data, supports the claim that the boat carrying Warren and others left Horn Island at approximately 4:31 that afternoon, due to mechanical failure. Multiple friends agree that Nolan chose to remain on the island rather than leave with that group. Beyond that point, the accounts fracture. One young woman's account of her time with Nolan, relayed through his mother, doesn't match what his mother has heard from others. The family's attorney has stated outright that some accounts from friends contradict each other, and that determining who's telling the truth is now central to the investigation. And Nolan's own parents have rejected the leading theory of an accidental drowning, saying they believe something more serious may have occurred and possibly been concealed. No official cause of death has been released. Toxicology results remain unfinished. What's certain is this: a mother said goodbye to her son on July 3rd. 2 days later, he was found. And in the weeks since, instead of narrowing toward an answer, this case has widened. Pulling in emergency audio, GPS records, conflicting friend accounts, a mother's growing distrust of the story she's been given, and a family's public rejection of the explanation authorities have offered so far. Somewhere in Mississippi tonight, a mother is still trying to reconcile two different versions of her son's last conversation with a stranger. A father is still asking why the explanation he's been given doesn't match the son he raised. Siblings are still living in a house that feels permanently unfinished, waiting for a piece of information that would finally let them begin to grieve without also having to keep fighting for the truth. And an attorney representing this family has said plainly that somebody involved in this story is not telling the truth. This isn't a case with an ending yet. It's a case where the timeline keeps sharpening, even as the full truth behind it keeps slipping further away. And somewhere in that gap between what's been documented and what still can't be explained, a family is left standing, holding their grief and their unanswered questions at the same time, with no way to set either one down until someone finally tells them what actually happened. Thank you for watching. We'll be back with the next confirmed update the moment there is one.